I never thought loneliness could feel this heavy, like a weight pressing down on my chest with every passing day. It wasn't just the silence in the house or the absence of another person's presence. It was the way the world felt different, emptier, like something vital had been stripped away. The days blurred together, each one feeling as dull and colorless as the one before. I woke up, went through the motions, made coffee I barely drank, scrolled through my phone without really seeing anything, and sat by the window watching the waves roll in from the ocean beyond my little house. It was peaceful here, or at least, it was supposed to be. That's why I had moved here in the first place, why I had imagined this place as a fresh start. But now, it just felt like an echo chamber, amplifying everything I had lost. I had thought I would be okay, that I could handle the breakup, that I could adjust to being on my own again. But the truth was, I wasn't okay. I had never been good at being alone, and now that I had no choice, it felt like I was unraveling. At first, I kept telling myself I just needed time. Time to process. Time to heal. Time to get back to being myself. But what if I didn't know who that was anymore? I had spent so many years in a relationship that I wasn't sure where I ended and where we had begun. And now that it was over, I felt like a part of me had been erased, leaving behind only a hollow space I didn't know how to fill. I tried to distract myself, tried to focus on little things, like rearranging furniture or taking long walks along the shoreline, but none of it made a difference. No matter what I did, the loneliness followed me. I could feel it in every quiet moment, in every night spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had ended up here. It wasn't just sadness. It was something deeper, something that made even the simplest tasks feel exhausting. Getting out of bed in the morning felt like a battle. The house was too quiet, the space beside me too empty. Even eating felt pointless. I would cook something simple, take a few bites, and then push the plate away, suddenly overwhelmed by the thought of finishing a meal alone. I stopped answering texts after a while. Friends checked in, family called, but I never knew what to say. How do you explain that nothing feels real anymore? That you're not sad in the way people expect, but in a way that makes everything feel distant? Like you're living underwater? Every time someone asked how I was doing, I lied. I said I was fine, that I was keeping busy, that I was figuring things out. But the truth was, I wasn't sure if I was figuring out anything at all. I didn't go out much, barely left the house unless I had to. The world outside felt too bright, too overwhelming. The thought of running into someone I knew, of having to smile and act normal, felt impossible. So I stayed inside, convinced myself that it was easier that way, that if I just kept to myself long enough, maybe the ache would fade on its own. But it didn't fade. It settled deep into my bones, a quiet, persistent emptiness that wouldn't let go. I tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that I was adjusting, that I was learning how to be alone, but I wasn't. The truth was, I had never felt more lost in my life. Nights were the worst. The loneliness was always louder at night, stretching across the hours like an unbearable weight. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds until exhaustion finally won. But even sleep wasn't an escape. I would wake up feeling just as tired as before, as if rest had become another thing that eluded me. Sometimes, I would turn to the other side of the bed instinctively, reaching out before I remembered that no one was there anymore. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut every single time. The house felt different now. It used to feel like home, like a place filled with warmth and laughter. But now, it just felt like a shell, a space I was inhabiting rather than living in. I kept the TV on most of the time, just for the noise, just so I wouldn't have to sit in complete silence. But even that didn't help much. The loneliness wasn't just around me, it was inside me, and no amount of background noise could drown it out. I told myself I just had to push through, that things would get better eventually, that this was just a phase. But what if it wasn't? What if this was just who I was now? I had never realized how much I had depended on another person's presence to feel like myself. Without them, I didn't know who I was supposed to be. I spent so much time reminiscing, replaying old conversations, remembering the way things used to be, that I barely paid attention to the present. I didn't want to think about the future. The future felt too uncertain, too vast and empty. I wasn't ready to face it, not yet. So instead, I just existed, drifting through the days, trying to hold myself together even though I wasn't sure why. The worst part was knowing that no one could fix this for me, that no one could step in and make the loneliness go away. This was mine to carry, mine to figure out. But I didn't know how. I didn't know where to start, and that terrified me more than anything. The only thing that made the loneliness bearable was Max. He had always been there, my golden retriever, my shadow, my quiet companion through the years. But after the breakup, his presence became something more. He wasn't just my dog anymore. He was my comfort, my anchor, the only thing that made the days feel a little less empty. No matter how lost I felt, no matter how heavy the silence in the house became, Max was there, steady and constant in a way that nothing else was. He followed me from room to room, never asking for anything, never demanding more than I could give. And somehow, that made all the difference. When I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV without really watching, he would curl up beside me, pressing his warm body against my leg, his head resting on my lap, as if he knew I needed something solid to hold on to. When I lay in bed at night, exhausted but unable to sleep, he would jump up beside me, settling in with a soft sigh, his breathing slow and steady, a rhythm that kept me grounded when everything else felt like it was slipping away. At first, I thought it was just habit, just the way he had always been. But the more time I spent wrapped in my own sadness, the more I realized that Max knew. He could sense it in ways that no one else could. He knew when the weight of it all became too much, when my hands shook as I poured my morning coffee, when my voice wavered just slightly as I talked to him in the quiet of the house. And every time, without fail, he was there. A nudge of his nose against my arm, a soft whine as he pressed his head into my chest, his way of saying, "I see you, I'm here." And I held on to that more than I ever thought I would. I started talking to him more than I talked to anyone else. It wasn't something I planned. It just happened. I would be standing at the sink, washing dishes I barely used, and I would start speaking out loud, telling Max things I couldn't say to anyone else. "I don't know if I'll ever feel normal again," I told him one afternoon, my voice barely above a whisper. He just looked at me, his brown eyes full of quiet understanding, and in that moment, it felt like he was the only one in the world who truly got it. I told him about the things I missed, about the memories that haunted me, about the parts of myself I wasn't sure I would ever get back. And even though he couldn't answer, even though he couldn't fix anything, just saying the words out loud made it feel a little less suffocating. The loneliness didn't disappear, but with Max beside me, it didn't feel quite as unbearable. He reminded me to get up in the morning, to go outside even when I didn't want to keep moving even when it felt pointless. When I forgot to eat, he would sit by his bowl, waiting patiently, reminding me that if he needed food, then I did too. When I buried myself under blankets, trying to shut out the world, he would paw at me until I let him in, curling up beside me in the quiet. He was more than just a dog. He was my tether to something real, something solid, something that reminded me I wasn't completely alone, no matter how much it felt like I was. Nights were the hardest, but Max made them easier. The bed had felt too big, too empty after the breakup, but with him there, it didn't feel quite as hollow. His steady breathing filled the silence, his warmth a reminder that there was still something in this house that made me feel safe. I told myself it was temporary, that eventually I wouldn't need him there as much, that eventually I would learn to sleep on my own again. But the truth was, I wasn't sure I wanted to, because the nights I spent without him felt too long, too cold, too lonely in a way I didn't want to face. People told me I was lucky to have him, that a pet's love was unconditional, that it was good to have something to take care of. And they were right. But what they didn't understand was that Max was taking care of me just as much as I was taking care of him. He was the only thing in my life that hadn't changed, the only thing that remained steady when everything else had fallen apart. And I held on to that, clung to it with everything I had. Because in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar, Max was the only thing that still made sense. I didn't realize how much I was relying on Max until I started noticing the way people looked at me when I talked about him. It wasn't immediate, but over time, it became clear that they saw something I wasn't ready to admit. My friends would ask if I was getting out, if I had been spending time with anyone, and I would shrug, brushing it off, saying that I was fine, that I had Max. At first, they would nod, agreeing that having a pet helped. But after a while, their smiles became tighter, their questions a little more pointed. My mom even asked me one evening if I thought maybe I was depending on Max a little too much. I had laughed, told her it wasn't like that, but deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. Because the truth was, Max had become more than just a comfort. He had become my everything. I started structuring my whole life around him without even thinking about it. If I made plans, I factored in how long I would be away from him. If I went to the store, I made sure to pick up little treats or a new toy, as if bringing him something would make up for the time I spent out of the house. I stopped going places for too long, not because I was afraid of being around people, but because I didn't like the way the house felt when Max wasn't there waiting for me. It was too quiet, too empty. And I hated the hollow feeling that crept in the moment I stepped inside without him greeting me at the door. I told myself it was normal, that I was just used to having him around. But I started noticing the way my heart raced if I couldn't find him right away, the way my breath caught if he didn't respond immediately when I called his name. It wasn't just that I loved him, it was that I needed him in a way that made me uneasy if I thought about it for too long. He had become my constant, my stability, the one thing in my life that felt certain, and I clung to that certainty like a lifeline. When I woke up in the morning, my first instinct was to reach for him, to feel the warmth of his fur, to hear the soft sound of his breathing. It was the only thing that reassured me, the only thing that made me feel safe. The idea of sleeping without him in the room made my chest tighten, like I was on the edge of a cliff, looking down into something I couldn't name. I started talking to him more, telling him everything, the way I used to talk to my ex, the way I had once confided in people who were no longer part of my life. I whispered my thoughts into the quiet of the night, telling Max about the things that kept me awake, the fears I couldn't say out loud to anyone else. I told him I was scared of moving on, of letting go, of finding out who I was without the person I had been with for so long. I told him I wasn't sure if I even knew how to be happy on my own. I told him about the dreams I had, the ones that left me feeling unsettled, the ones where I was always searching for something but never quite finding it. And Max would just listen, his big brown eyes watching me like he understood every word. Maybe that was why I talked to him so much. Because with him, I didn't have to explain myself. He never told me I was overthinking, never told me to just move on, never made me feel like I was too much. He just stayed by my side, steady and constant, and that was enough. People started to notice the change in me, but I brushed off their concerns. They told me I needed to get out more, that I should start dating again, that I should at least try to reconnect with old friends. I nodded, agreed, even made a few half-hearted attempts, but none of it felt right. The thought of sitting across from someone new, of trying to piece together a conversation, felt exhausting. The idea of filling the silence with anything other than Max's quiet presence felt unbearable. He had become my safe place, the one thing in my life that made sense, and I wasn't ready to let go of that. I kept telling myself that this was temporary, that I was just going through a phase, that eventually I would start feeling normal again. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I wanted to. Because the more time I spent with Max, the more I realized that I didn't feel lonely when I was with him. And if being with him made me feel okay, why should I try to change that? Why should I force myself into a world that didn't feel like it had space for me anymore? Maybe this was enough. Maybe he was enough. And even though I could hear the concern in my friends' voices and see the worry in their eyes, I wasn't sure if I cared. Because Max was here, and he understood me in a way that no one else did. And right now, that was all I needed. It started slowly, so slowly that I didn't even notice it at first. Just little things. Moments where I felt more tired than I should have, where I woke up feeling just as exhausted as when I had gone to sleep. I thought maybe it was just stress, that my body was finally catching up to the weight of everything I had been carrying since the breakup. It made sense. I had been feeling drained for a while, emotionally, if not physically, and I figured my body was just responding to that. But as the days passed, the tiredness didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I would wake up in the morning feeling like I had barely slept at all, my limbs heavy, my mind foggy. At first, I ignored it, pushing through the exhaustion, telling myself that it was normal, that I just needed more rest. But then I started noticing how quickly it drained me, how even simple things, like walking to the kitchen or folding laundry, felt like they took more effort than they should. I would sit down for just a moment to catch my breath, only to realize that I didn't have the energy to get back up right away. It didn't make sense. I wasn't sick. I wasn't doing anything differently. But every day, the exhaustion clung to me a little more, wrapping around me like a weight I couldn't shake. Max was the only thing that kept me moving. If it weren't for him, I might have just stayed in bed all day, letting the tiredness swallow me whole. But he needed to be fed, needed to be walked, and so I forced myself up, out the door, through the motions of daily life. It felt like I was moving in slow motion, like the world around me was sharp and bright, while I was stuck in a haze. Even the simplest tasks became daunting. The grocery store felt overwhelming, the lights too harsh, the people too loud. I would find myself standing in the middle of an aisle, staring at a box of cereal, my brain unable to process what I had come there for. I started avoiding going out altogether, convincing myself that I didn't really need anything, that I could just get by with whatever I already had at home. It wasn't worth the effort. Nothing was. At night, the exhaustion should have made it easy to sleep, but it didn't. I would lie in bed, my body aching with fatigue, my mind too clouded to form full thoughts. But still, I wouldn't sleep deeply. It was like I was hovering just beneath the surface, never fully resting, never fully waking. And every morning, I would wake up feeling worse. The heaviness in my limbs became familiar, the fog in my head something I just learned to work around. I stopped setting alarms because I always woke up before them anyway, staring at the ceiling, feeling like I had been running in my sleep instead of resting. People started noticing. My mom asked if I was okay, said I looked pale, that I seemed out of it. My friends told me I should see a doctor, that maybe it was low iron or some kind of deficiency. I nodded, agreed, told them I would, but I didn't. I didn't want to admit that something was wrong. Because if I admitted it, then I would have to do something about it, and I didn't have the energy for that. I convinced myself it would pass, that I just needed time, that I just needed to adjust. Max never left my side. He seemed to sense the way my energy was slipping, the way I moved slower, the way I sighed more than I spoke. He stayed close, always watching me, always pressing against me when I sat down, as if he could hold me together through sheer presence alone. And I let him. I let him curl up beside me at night, let his steady breathing lull me into something close to sleep, even though I never woke up feeling rested. I started to wonder if I would ever feel rested again. The worst part was that I couldn't figure out why this was happening. I hadn't changed anything. I was eating, even if not much. I wasn't doing anything physically demanding. There was no reason for me to feel like this. But the exhaustion only deepened, stretching into every part of my day until it felt like even breathing took effort. I caught myself avoiding the mirror because I didn't want to see the dark circles under my eyes, the way my skin seemed duller, the way my shoulders slumped as if the weight of my own body was too much to hold up. I didn't recognize myself, and that scared me more than anything. Because if I wasn't me anymore, then who was I? I told myself I was fine. I told myself it would get better. But deep down, I wasn't sure if I believed that anymore. I couldn't keep ignoring it. The exhaustion wasn't going away, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself that it was just stress, that it would pass, a part of me knew something wasn't right. It wasn't normal to wake up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. It wasn't normal to feel my limbs ache from nothing, to have my mind clouded over like I was constantly half asleep. I started questioning everything, trying to figure out if something had changed, if there was anything I was doing differently. I thought about my diet, my routines, my habits, but nothing stood out. Everything was the same, except for Max. Max had been sleeping in my room every night since the breakup. I had let him in because his presence made me feel safe, because I couldn't stand the silence, because I needed something familiar beside me. But as much as I loved having him there, I couldn't ignore the way my fatigue had started right around the same time. It was a ridiculous thought, and I hated even considering it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was a connection. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that Max, the one thing keeping me grounded, could be part of what was making me feel this way. But I had no other answers, and I was tired of feeling like this. So, one night, I forced myself to leave him outside my bedroom door. I hated it. The moment I closed the door, I felt that awful emptiness settle over me, the silence pressing down in a way that made my chest ache. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of Max shifting around in the living room, waiting for sleep to come. It took hours. My body felt restless, like it didn't know what to do without him there. But when I finally drifted off, something was different. I didn't wake up as much. My sleep wasn't perfect, but it was deeper, heavier. And when morning came, for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I had been dragged through a tunnel of exhaustion. It wasn't a huge difference, but it was enough to make me wonder. Enough to make me try again the next night, and the next. And each morning, the same thing happened. I still felt tired, but not as much. The heaviness in my limbs wasn't as strong. My head wasn't quite as foggy. The realization unsettled me. I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want to think that something as simple as keeping Max out of my bedroom could be changing the way I felt. It made no sense. He was just a dog, my best friend, my comfort. How could his presence at night be affecting me like this? I needed to know more. The thought of it gnawed at me all day, and by the time night rolled around, I made a decision. I was going to record myself while I slept. I wasn't even sure what I expected to find, but I needed to see if something was happening at night that I wasn't aware of. I set up my phone on my nightstand, pressed record, and forced myself to go to sleep. The night felt like any other. I woke up feeling slightly better than I had before, the same small improvement I had started to notice. But when I reached for my phone and played the recording back, my stomach twisted. At first it was normal, just me shifting under the blankets, breathing evenly. Then, a few hours in, I saw it. The bedroom door opened, slowly, quietly, as if someone had pushed it open without making a sound. And then there was Max. He stepped inside, moving with a carefulness I had never seen from him before. He wasn't his usual energetic self, wasn't bounding toward the bed the way he normally did. He was slow, deliberate. He walked up to my bedside and just stood there, watching. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I watched the footage. He didn't move for several minutes. He just stood there, staring at me while I slept. And then, almost too subtly to notice at first, he leaned in. Close. Closer than he should have been. His breath was steady, almost unnaturally so. And then, nothing. The video played on, and he eventually curled up on the floor beside the bed. But something about it felt wrong. I rewound, watching it again, trying to figure out why it unsettled me so much. It wasn't just that he had come in when I knew I had locked the door. It wasn't just the way he had stood there, unmoving, watching me sleep. It was the way my body reacted in the footage. As he got closer, I shifted in my sleep. Not like someone simply rolling over, but like something was affecting me. My breaths became shallower. My face tensed like I was in discomfort. My fingers twitched as if I was trying to wake up but couldn't. And then, as he pulled away, my body stilled again, relaxing back into the bed. My heart pounded as I watched it over and over, trying to understand what I was seeing. It didn't make sense. It was just Max. He wasn't doing anything. And yet, something in my gut told me there was more to this. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screen, feeling a mix of fear and confusion settle over me. Was this all in my head? Was I imagining connections that weren't there? Or was there something happening that I didn't understand? I needed to know more. But for the first time since this all started, I wasn't sure if I wanted the answers. Because deep down, something told me that once I found them, there would be no going back.